welcome to our event for this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jasper Newport, and I'm here to represent the Students Advocating Gender Equality Society at the Diplomatic Academy. Today, we're hosting a discussion on the women and youth movement in Iran and the protests that have been in Iran for the last few months. And the SAGE Society is absolutely honored today to be joined by Dr. Alizadeh. So before we get into the discussion, I'd just like to offer a brief introduction of Dr. Alizadeh and his work in the field of human rights. So, Dr. Alizadeh grew up in Iran and Switzerland, attending high school in Tehran and Shiraz. Following that, he went to the University of Vienna, where he completed a PhD in political science and law. After completing his PhD, he made the excellent choice to study at the Diplomatic Academy, graduating from the two-year program in 1983. He then took a route which has since been followed by many DA students, joining the Austrian Interior Ministry. In particular, Dr. Alizadeh worked in the Department for Refugees and Migration, and in his work in the Interior Ministry, he had the notable early success of being able to bring over 200 Kurdish refugees from Iraq to Austria during the 1991 Gulf War. After his work at the Interior Ministry, Dr. Alizadeh switched to working at the UN and at human rights institutions such as the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where he served in a series of different high-profile roles across the globe. There are a lot of highlights to choose from when I was looking at his career at the UN, and so I've just chosen three to introduce you guys today. Firstly, Dr. Alizadeh provided human rights training and investigated genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s following the conflict there. Secondly, he served as the head of office for the UN in South Sudan during the Darfur conflict. And he also worked as the High Commission for Human Rights representative in Southeast Asia. Since working at the UN, Dr. Alizadeh has returned to working in Europe. And since his return here, he has worked on EU policy for third country persons and stateless people at the European Union. And he has also contributed to the work of the European Asylum Support Office during the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. Throughout this exceptional and storied career, Dr. Alizadeh has remained focused on the human rights situation in Iran, taking a number of high-profile roles in Austria, such as chairing the Committee for the Defense of Human Rights in Iran. And recently, he has set up a new committee which aims to directly support the women and youth movement in Iran. So on behalf of SAGE and the wider DA community, I warmly welcome Dr. Alizadeh and thank him very much for joining us today. So if everyone would join me in giving him a big round of applause, Dr. Alizadeh.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Newport. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you tonight to speak about the current situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I will try to be very brief, and then I'm more interested in having a dialogue and discussion with you on what's happening in Iran and what will happen in the region. The uprising of women and youth in Iran was triggered by the death of a young woman, Mahsa Jina Amini, a Kurdish woman who was arrested by the morality police on 13 September 2002 for violating the Islamic dress code. She was brought to the police station where she was beaten on the head, and she died after 3 years to inner brain bleeding. The uprising and protests in Iran, which have been ongoing for 4 months, has had a significant impact on the country's domestic balance of power. The Islamic Republic is indeed in the deepest internal crisis of the last 44 years. Let me briefly describe the current socio-economic situation in the country. It seems that the country finds itself in an economic and political impasse. This uprising is the continuation of a nationwide protests against the economic situation in the country, which started in December 2017, especially with regard to the high youth unemployment, unpaid and inadequate wages, growing income inequality, the worker strikes, the devaluation of the Iranian currency rials against the US dollar, food price rises, and water shortages in major cities. These are serious problems for the regime, which is unable to take the necessary remedial actions. In addition, through widespread corruption, mismanagement, and abuse of power, the regime has lost all religious and socio-political legitimacy in the eyes of the Iranian population. The cause of the protests in Iran is not only the death of Ms. Mahsa Jina Amini or not following the hijab dress code, but it's the widespread cry against 44 years suppression of the Iranian population. Freedom, secularism, and political pluralism are the main demands of the demonstrators, who are led by young people and in which women and girls are strongly represented. As said before, the uprising is the time break or the beginning of a new era in the current history of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Some observers believe even that this uprising is the beginning of the end of the era of Khomeinism in Iran. The question here is, what are the impacts of the internal policy of the country? For the ruling class of the Islamic Republic, these demands are difficult to meet for both the conservatives and the reform-oriented factions. This is because the Islamic Republic's code of values is based on the Islamic religion, meaning the Shiism values, and on the ideas of its founder, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in fact one of the first political religious leaders of the last century to embrace Islam, the Shiism, as a political ideology and institutionalize it in political form. The demand of the protesters, who now appear to represent a large portion of the population, are therefore against these founding principles and values of the Islamic Republic. We are witnessing an ongoing cultural revolution, a kind of Iranian rebirth. The current movement of the movement and youth in Iran wishes to overcome the use of religion, in this case Islam, as a political ideology. This movement desires a free, democratic, and a political system in Iran based on respecting human rights and pluralism, a separation of power, government, and religion. This new post-revolutionary generation is non-ideological and mainly uses digital platforms to communicate with the world. It is a generation whose love of freedom, or Alizadeh in Persian, is spreading among older generation. These courageous people question the Islamic Republic on a daily basis, risking arrest, death in the street, or severe punishment. The Islamic Republic is not a monolith. It's a complex political system that falls into the category of hybrid regimes. For this reason, it will try to contain and neutralize these revolts using various methods to survive. With the execution of two young protesters, Mohsen Shakeri and Majid Reza Rahnavard, the ruling class is taking a hardline approach. Shakeri's guilt was to prevent the security forces from moving forward on the street. Reportedly, there are currently 26 people that have been sentenced to death, and over 24,000 persons have been arrested. Young girls have been raped after being arrested by security forces and released later on. There are reports that detained persons are treated by drugs in order to bring the will of the young people. There are also reports that over 500 persons lost their eyes as security forces shot with hard plastic bullets directly in the eyes of the demonstrators. The question whether the current regime can be reformed is probably to be answered negatively. But the fact is that the mood of the population has changed, and people are more and more determined to overcome the rules and values imposed by the Islamic Republic. The decline of the legitimacy of the existing political religious system is certainly evident. The main question is, what would happen next? In my opinion, there are three scenarios as a consequence of the current protest in Iran. One, if a national nationwide strike will be followed by workers in the country's main occupational sectors, such as oil and steel production. Teachers, there are 2 million teachers in Iran. Truck drivers, a huge number. Employees in various economic sectors, as well as hospital staff. And a part of the Revolutionary Guard and Iranian army would change their position in supporting the nationwide movement. This would bring a change in the current political system of Iran. In this regard, the question raises, who will lead the revolution against the current regime in Iran this time? Because the current women and youth movement has not yet defined its leader with a defined political program. A second possible scenario could be also that the Revolutionary Guards might try to overthrow Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, thus ending mullahs' rule in Iran and then to take power themselves. This would mean a backward of the democratization process in Iran for many, many years. It would also mean that Iran would be a second North Korea in the region. As a third scenario, a nationwide escalation of protests could provoke an internal armed conflict like in Syria and Libya, plunging the country into chaos and anarchy. This is because many countries in the region would like to see a divided Iran to end the supremacy of the current regime in Tehran. What are the impact of the women's and youth movement in Iran in the whole region? We know that the commonalities of the countries of the Middle East and North Africa are particularly interdependent, as the Arab uprising in 2011 clearly demonstrated. On the one hand, the protests that first erupted in Tunisia spread like wildfire throughout the region. On the other hand, several governments were able to learn from each other on how to develop strategies to contain and suppress uprisings that had previously been affected by similar events. This, along with one of the defining features of the globalization, and knowing that domestic affairs of nation states are no longer purely domestic, suggests that recent development in Iran may represent a new turning point for civil societies in the region, and consequently a new challenge for several governments in the region. The uprising in Iran exposes the weaknesses of an inadequate, poorly functioning, and repressive political system that could undermine regional order and the stability of governments in the regions as follows. A, given the nature and political system of the existing regimes in the region, and particularly in the Persian Gulf, makes them vulnerable to spillover effects. On the one hand, Iran's rival governments, particularly Israel and other Arab countries in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, could benefit from instability in the Islamic Republic and should be pleased if the regional and rival runs into serious domestic political trouble. This domestic turmoil would force the regime in Tehran to turn inward, dealing with its own domestic problems, which in turn would allow the neighboring countries to strengthen their position in the region. On the other hand, in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, we have seen little Schadenfreude over Iran's domestic troubles, as they think that similar popular mobilization could occur in their countries as well. The individual freedom and democratic accountability are the desires of millions of people throughout the Middle East and the region. And the failure of the 2011 uprising has not deterred citizens in Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon from mobilizing against the regimes. While Tehran's rivals may take advantages of the Islamic Republic movement of weakness, Arab states should be concerned about the scale of protests that could inspire their own civil societies. Other countries in the Middle East, such as Syria and Lebanon, may be more affected because of their clear transnational and direct alignment with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Both countries are in a difficult position. Lebanon is still suffering from 2019 protests, triggered by a chronic economic crisis from which it cannot recover, and the persistence of a rigid sectarian political system. Syria is in the midst of a slow and difficult post-conflict reconstruction process, owes the survival of its regime to Tehran, and requires substantial investments as well as political support that Russia may no longer be able to provide due to the war in the Ukraine. If Tehran were to move farther away from its foreign policy commitment to take care of the domestic situation, Syrian Hezbollah could become increasingly isolated, which would benefit other actors in the region, maybe Saudi Arabia and Turkey. There is always a risk that Tehran will export its instability, while there is no evidence that Iran intends to create incidents outside the country that could distract its citizens from the current domestic situation. Authoritarian regimes that sense the threat of their own demise often resort to conflict abroad to suppress dissent at home. Exploiting the volatile regional environment could ensure that regime weakness is seen by Iranians as a door opener for foreign intervention or interference, thus forcing them to rein in their opposition. It is very difficult to predict how Iranian protests will turn out domestically and what impact they will have or will have abroad if they continue. However, given the authoritarian backlash in the region following 2011 uprisings, the protests have the potential to further destabilize the region. The direction, chaos, or genuine democratic political change has yet to be answered. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much for that excellent summary of the current protests we've seen in Iran. I especially enjoyed hearing about the international side of it. That's definitely an aspect of the ongoing movement that is little reported. And so now we'll open up the discussion to you guys. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Alizadeh, now's the time. Wow. I might start off by...
Everything is clear.
I might start off by asking
Please
about the role of non-governmental organizations in the current movement. As you've said, there's a lot of sort of competing priorities and incentives for neighboring states to interact with Iran and the women and youth movement, but are NGOs playing an important role?
Certainly. I mean, the fact that I didn't mention with regard to the current situation of protest in Iran is you have a huge international lobbying now against the state in Tehran. That means you have a huge campaigning of artists, of writers, of politicians who are focusing on the suppression mechanism in Iran. That is actually unique. We haven't seen it over the 43 years existence of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of course, my generation, I belong to those who were against the Shah. And we hoped with the revolution we will have a democratic system established in Iran, but it was not the case. Of course, the Iranian student movement organized a lot of protests and demonstrations in European and American states, but the dimension of the current support of the Iranian abroad is unique and huge. And this gives, coming back to your question, a genuine support to the NGOs working in Iran. As you know, somebody was telling me that the Iranian, the Evin, the famous Evin prison is the current University of Iran, because you have all the intellectuals, all the workers, employees, artists, sportsmen, sportwomen, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, Baha'is, etc. So that means you have a huge number of prisoners, political prisoners currently in Iran. And this would certainly and psychologically give them a support that they are not alone, that the people, Iranian abroad, and not only the Iranian abroad, but also the European and other countries are taking care about the destiny of the people in Iran.
Thank you very much. We've got a microphone, if that's all right.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation. So Andy Warhol once said that everybody gets 15 minutes of fame. And in Iran now, it seems like there was 15 minutes of infamy. So at the beginning of this uprising, there were a lot of news reports, a lot of information. But now, even an execution doesn't get much attention, unfortunately. So how can, aside from NGOs, how can people massage the media and social media to bring more attention to this so the flame doesn't go out? Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's a very good question. But there are channels of communication with abroad. There are Iranians, as Mr. Newport told you, we have recently created the committee for the support of the women's and youth movement in Iran, the so-called Mahsajina Amini initiatives. And some of the people are sitting here. They have a direct contact with people in Iran, even in Iranian prisons. And they get direct informations. And of course, to get the information is the one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, how reliable is this information? If we get this information, but we have to check it several times because we know that there are fake news going around, and we have to avoid that committee such, which is actually recognized as a reliable source of information, being able to provide correct information outside. So it's more difficult, of course. The government, actually, the strategy of the public relation has changed recently because the government has recognized, actually giving the number of detainees and also the execution would deter the people, would create a fear among the population not to say anything and to prevent them to taking action against the government. But giving the attention of the international community, now we know that the government changed the strategy not to state any executions or any violation of human rights because they know exactly. At the end of the day, of course, they are also fear that when one day this regime is not existing anymore, to which country they are going to. I mean, before was Venezuela as a country that many Iranians bought homes and lands for future to be able to leave the country when a revolution is taking place. But as we know that Venezuela is going to be recognized by the United States, and a kind of approach have been taken recently. So the question is what the people are going to do. And this is another negative aspect of the side of the story, and this is why they are trying to stay as much as they can, and they will oppress the population as much as they can.
Thank you very much. Maria?
First of all, thank you very much for being here and for your presentation. My name is
Pleasure.
Maria Blumenhofer, and I'm also a student here at the Diplomatic Academy. My question is actually connected to the previous question. It's about also the current political crisis that are very short-lived in the media due to only momentary coverage and the sensationalism. And do you think that this is due to the amount of crisis going on, that the crisis, especially in the eastern part of the world, are very short-lived in the European people's minds? Or is that ignorance or probably also discrimination?
It's very complex. It's not so easy. First of all, I think the situation in, starting with that, selling the drones to Russia was totally underestimated among the politicians in Iran. They didn't recognize how much attention will be given to this issue, because you have a war in Europe, and nobody knows when this horrible war is going to be ended. So the underestimation, and this is also the reputation of the whole government is at risk. This is the one side of the story. The other side of the story is what would be with the GPACO, this atomic agreement? Is dead? Are the United States and the allies, these 5 member states of the UN Security Council, going to continue with the negotiations with the government of Iran? I doubt. But the other hand is another risk, and this is why the Western observers say Iran will be able to have in 2 years' time an atomic bomb. I am not the expert, but this is what the observers say. So we are sitting in a dilemma. What should be done with the current government of Iran? Do we negotiate? But in which way? And we know a government that is killing its own people. On the one hand, you have the public opinion. On the other hand, you have the authorities in Europe and United States, and they are in dilemma what to do. Are we going to support the protest? But this protest has not a face, a political face. Some people say that the son of Shah, who is residing in Washington, will be the kind of alternative, which personally I don't think so. Doesn't have any chance, because this young generation in Iran doesn't know the time of Shah, and neither what the young, he's not anymore a young man, but he is going to do. So I think a long term, the Iranian democratization process has to be continued. This is the only way. And I'm sure if this women's and youth movement will succeed in changing political landscape in Iran, there will be a huge bomb in the whole region. And this is the hope of the young generation. Not only in Iran, not only in Lebanon, not only in Syria, but also in European countries.
And just to push you a bit further on that, although you yourself have said that you wouldn't support the involvement of the last Shah of Iran's son, it's interesting that
I support no.
No, you don't support.
No. No.
It's interesting that that sort of option of the Shah's son involvement is even on the table. So, just to push you further on that, what sort of groups are advocating for his involvement, and how influential are they?
I'm not going to discuss with you on his political program or who is giving him advice, but I would only say let's wait. The time will be the main factor to see. I always say the destiny of the future of Iran is going to be decided inside the country and not outside of the country. They may have a role to play in a future government, they may, but everything is going to be decided inside the country and not abroad.
Yeah, Laura.
I wanted to ask about the fact that you just mentioned at the beginning of your speech that the woman that died in the beginning was Kurdish. At some point in the ongoing protests, I heard that there was a severe crackdown on the Kurdish population in Iran by the Iranian regime. What role does this group of the population play in the uprising right now, or the protests, as you want to call it? And how may it affect, in general, the group in the region? Iran is not the only country that has a significant Kurdish minority in the region, so yeah, thank you.
Thank you, good question. First of all, Iran has a lot of ethnic minorities, Kurdish, Turkish, Arab origins. You have Baluch, you have Qashqai, you have a lot of tribes in Iran. Kurdistan, based on its historical background, has always been the central point of suppression of the central government in Tehran. And the Kurdish movement have always, because many people say, no, they are separatists, they want to have their own state, which is according to the United Nations statute, a legitimate demand. But the fact is that the minorities have been suffering a lot in Iran. And of course, the powers outside will be using this a small ethnical conflict in Iran to overthrow the regime in Tehran. We know, for example, in Azerbaijan, in the Republic of Azerbaijan, there are military bases and they are delivering weapons from north to Mahabad, for example. We know that weapons are coming from Iraq to Kurdistan. We know that Arab tribes in Khuzestan are giving weapons from Arab countries. And we know also that weapons are delivering through Pakistan to Balochistan and Sistan. So it is a very, very volatile situation. It's not that we stay here and say everything will be okay, no. But I come back to my colleague, Ms. Kazemi. I learned for her at this discussion that she said if the minorities would have taken weapons in their hand and fighting militarily against the regime, this has not yet happened. And this is the hope, that we hope we are not going to an internal conflict based on ethnic minorities, population, or disparities, discrimination, and that it wouldn't be a peaceful solution, I'm sure. But to what extent the violence will be a major factor, I'm not a prophet. I hope I could answer your question.
I have two questions. The first one is, how would you assess the current dynamics of the protest, the uprising? I think the picture we get here from media is that crackdowns are being more successful currently, and I would just be interested in a maybe more picture that is more relevant or more up to date. And the second question is a little bit more pertaining to the role of women. And I read an assessment which I found was very interesting, is that the regime is holding on to the control over women's bodies in the form, for example, of clothing regulations, because they have lost all the other control. For example, they cannot show anything for economic success. They cannot show any progress in normalization of relations, with sanctions, for example, with the whole nuclear deal falling through, stuff like that. And this control over women's bodies is one of the last things they can show for, especially towards the hardline conservatives that support them. And I would just like to hear your opinion on the statement, if you think it's accurate. Thank you.
Thank you. The current dynamic, I mean, my question at the beginning of the uprising was how long this youth and women protest will last. Because you cannot go on a daily basis to the street and protest against this huge machinery of the suppression. But we are in the 4th month of the protest, and this is a unique situation in the history of the 43 years existence of this Islamic Republic of Iran. Now the situation is calm, but it does not say that we will have the next wave of protest within the next weeks or months. Because as I told you, the demonstration in Iran, and the biggest one when Ahmadinejad was elected, and over 1 million people came to the street to protest against the ballot manipulation. And there were a lot of young people who came also to the street. And there was a huge number of victims. 8 years later, 9 years later, you had the next 2017, one of the biggest nationwide demonstration, and then 2019. That means the interval of the protest is becoming shorter and shorter. My personal opinion is that the next huge demonstration will become, or will be, based on hunger people, because we have a huge poverty throughout the country. This unemployment of the youth is nothing. The very, very expensive price of bread, of rice, of other elementary nutrition hasn't been so high over, I don't know, over 200, 300 years ago. So the people are, the mass population are suffering under economic. I can tell you one friend was telling me that in the north part of Tehran, there are specific days, and the son and girls of these rulers, of the mullahs, driving with Porsche, Maserati, Ferrari, Lamborghini, and doing a race on the street. On the other hand, you have workers that has to fight to get a supper for his family, for his wife and children. So the situation is very, very risky. And especially this government, Raisi, actually, probably some of you should know that Raisi was member of the so-called death squad. He was the death committee in 1988. In 1988, when Mujahideen attacked Iraq, Khomeini gave a fatwa that all the prisoners, and they were also prisoners, young prisoners, who were supposed to be released in few weeks, to execute them. That means in July to September 1998, almost between 4,500 and 5,000 political prisoners were executed, which some experts qualify this as a crime against humanity. Sorry, I lost my line. But anyway, the situation is volatile in Iran, and we are facing a very, very uncertain future.
Just on the volatility of the current social and economic situation in Iran, to what extent are sanctions from the United States and other Western states blamed for sort of pushing Iran into a higher level of poverty than it's seen previously?
I mean, as I work with the UN and I was dealing with some countries, and I know that the sanction imposed, I know about Iraq very well, the 6-year sanctions against Saddam Hussein. Within that period of time, over 400,000 babies died due to lack of basic nutrition. The sanction imposed on Iran is borne by the population, not the government officials, not the rulers. There is a lack of medicine. There is a lack of basic, provisions that is necessary for the life, for the daily life. The population is suffering, but not the upper class, not the mullahs, not the rulers. They have their nice life. I mean, I was told that special flights being organized from abroad to bring even luxury stuff to the people who are ruling this country. But the population is at stake. The population is suffering, simply said.
Great, thank you. Yeah, at the back of that.
Thank you. My question is, do you think that the European foreign policy approach that we now have is enough? Also speaking of those sanctions, because I know that a lot of Austrian and European politicians have taken on partnerships to support the convicted ones in the Iran, but the question is whether that actually makes an impact and that's enough to show our solidarity, or whether we could also think about targeted sanctions also for the richer ones, like freezing their assets or travel bans for the leaders of the system.
Thank you. Sorry, I missed your second question. Yes, I mean, some people, I cannot remember who, it's 30 years ago, said the women will be the next revolution generation overthrowing the regime. Because the women were the main victims of the whole system. I'm not going to describe the extent of the discrimination, but the women as such is not being accepted as a woman. For example, a man who is giving witness for the same case, there should be 2 women. Or the sister gets the half of the heritage as the brother. And I can tell you, we haven't spoken about using of drugs in Iran is huge. The addiction, the number of addicted in Iran is very, very high. It's not only about heroin or morphine. Crystal meth, I was told the crystal meth is the common drug being used by the youth in Iran. Or we know that there are borders of young boys being used by the mullahs. This is that it's horrifying what's happening in Iran. Coming back to your question, yes, the woman is being seen as a subject, be there to satisfy the wishes of the men. That's it, not more. Sanctions, yes. One of the reasons why we tried to establish the Mahsa Jina Amini initiative was to do everything to make a kind of, or to create possibilities to stop the activities of the Revolutionary Guards and the Islamic Republic abroad. For example, we know that over the last 10 years, a huge number of firms and companies have been established in Austria, but nobody knows from where the money is coming, even under the sanction of the United Nations and the USA. Or we know that Iran has the highest number of the diplomats in Austria. They have one ambassador in the embassy with huge number of other diplomats. They have an ambassador at the Atom Energy Agency with a huge number of people. Then we have the ambassador in the UN as such, and then have the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the OPEC. And then we have also probably people working for the embassy in the Imam Ali Center. So we have a huge number, and this is why we would like to reduce the number of diplomats, which in turn, their task is to observe the opposition abroad and to make report to Tehran, which in turn again, the family members of those people observed be subject of political persecution. So this is why we try to convince the authorities in Austria to reduce the number of diplomats in Austria. Then, of course, we have a number of companies, not only in Austria, but also in other European countries, which have provided expertise and electronic equipment to cut, for example, the internet in Iran. I was told to cut down or to cut, or to shut down or cut the internet. A nationwide cut is impossible. You need a special expertise on this. Because The normal demonstrator, they cannot communicate to each other because the internet is cut down. But the security forces, they have the possibility to use the internet. This is why we would like to identify those firms and companies, or we know that they were, as the drones were analyzed in the Ukraine, they were at least 40 pieces of electronic items that have been provided by the US and European companies. Even Iran is under sanction. The other thing is that the people of the government have already started to apply asylum in Austria under other reasons, political reasons, not giving their own identity what they were working with the government before. And of course, we would like to see a reduced number of entry visa for government officials coming to Europe, to European countries, to limit their movement in Europe and United States and Australia and otherwise. So they are the actions that we think are necessary to make the life of these people a little bit more difficult and to limit their activities abroad.
Thank you. So you mentioned, I guess, like a gap, like a socioeconomic gap between like the poverty that's emerging in Iran and then an elite class that I guess drives their Ferraris and Lamborghinis, et cetera, et cetera. I guess, is there any socioeconomic movement within the elite class towards, I guess, change in Iran? Is there any desire in the elite class to bring about change, or is there a desire, I guess, to just continue to maintain the status quo? Thank you.
I have no information on that the ruling class are critical to what's happening in Iran. I don't know. I mean, a normal thinking person should be in a position to distinguish what's happening in Iran. I'm sure there are people, but we don't know who.
Just to go a bit further, perhaps, on the shape of protest movements in Iran, would you say it's fair to characterize the women and youth movement as predominantly urban, or have we also seen protests and engagement in rural areas?
Oh yeah, no. With Mahsa Jina Amini's death, there were protests simultaneously in over 80 cities in Iran, nationwide, and this widened to 135 cities. So it means you have also in the rural area people who are again living in poverty and do not agree with the ruling of the country. The other thing that I forgot to mention is the fact that, because I mentioned in my statement that when the worker class, or when the worker, especially in the oil and steel industry, will join the movement, we have to take into consideration that normally the workers in Iran are very conservative and they are religious. And they can hardly identify themselves with the youth movement, because what the youth movement want to have a normal life, which in turn also applies to the poor people, but with a big distinction. that the youth is more living in a sphere that is not goes inside the life of a normal, of a worker's life. That means the workers cannot identify themselves with the ideology, or I wouldn't say an ideology, but with the environmental demand of the youth, because they are still conservative, because they are still religious. Again, my guess is that the next big demonstration will take place not only with the youth and women, but also hunger people, poor people coming to the street and protesting against the regime.
Anna, are we doing okay on that? Two more questions, sure.
So you talked about the three scenarios, and in one of them you mentioned about the movement, the revolutionary movement having no leader. So it was interesting for me to know, what do you think if there was someone who would lead the revolution with a defined political agenda around whom people could gather around? Would that make the revolution, take the revolution to a new level, and, for example, coming to the first scenario, pushing it to a national strike by the workers? Thank you.
Good question. The protests is taking place throughout the country, but they are the little leaders among the youth, among the women. Without leaders, it's not going to function. For example, I give you an example. The strategy of the protesters or demonstrators is, or was, that they gathered in a place, protested, and did their action. But before the security forces arrived, they disappeared and dispersed themselves, and gathered in another place of Tehran. So this strategy was very heavy for security forces, because they become tired, but not the young generation. So they have the small leaders, even lorry drivers, teachers, hospital personnel, they have their own representatives. We have a lot of political prisoners who might be next leader in the future in Iran. But of course, due to the fear and the suppression, they are not going to name anybody as a leader at this stage. But it comes, I'm sure. And this is a new form of protests that hasn't been done in other countries.
Thank you so much for your talk. The current movement in Iran needs more media attention and involvement of the international political community to provide pressure and change. Why aren't the protest organizers getting the foreign media more involved to spread the news and directly put pressure on their respective governments to help the Iranian people achieve their goals?
As I said before, the international community is staying, if you want to use the word impasse. They don't know what to do now. Continue with the negotiations with the government and the GPCO? Should they recognize, but who? Of course, as I said, the son of Shah is trying, but I'm sure there are coming other actors to the scene. There would be a kind of I wouldn't say an alternative, faces that could be, but again, outside is not the main issue what's happening will be in Iran. The issue of the press. Of course, the press is giving attention. I mean, you have to see these 4 months covering Iran was huge and hasn't been the case in the past. So this is a very positive aspect of the whole issue. And I'm sure that journalists will be traveling to Iran clandestinely and not publicly, and I'm sure there will be coming reports what's happening in Iran. And of course, I can tell you that young people have started to leave the country due to the political persecution, and they would like come to Europe and apply for asylum. But as you know, European countries have built a big wall around themselves, hindering refugees coming to European countries to apply for asylum.
Thank you very much. And I think with that last question, we're unfortunately out of time. So once again, thank you very, very much.
With pleasure.
And a big round of applause. Thank you so much.